Good afternoon. This is Stephen O'Grady. I am the co-founder of Redmonk. Redmonk is a developer-focused industry analyst firm. I'm here today to talk to you about a couple things that we learned at the Cloud Foundry Summit this week. It was held in lovely Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And as a quick shout out to the Cloud Foundry organizers, as somebody who lives in Portland, Maine, not the one on the West Coast, it's always nice to have a 45-minute or hour flight, as opposed to having to trek all the way out to the West Coast. So big thanks for that. The Philadelphia city is beautiful. I have been there many times. Always love it. Did not obviously get to spend all that much time out about at the city because I was too busy running around the event itself. But highly recommend visiting if you get the chance. The conference center is a bit of a maze. It's fine if you come in the right door. If you come in on the sort of far side of it, it's quite the journey. But anyhow, so we're here to talk about the Cloud Foundry event. Overall, at the event, I thought the energy was pretty very good. From talking to the organizers, talking to sort of a bunch of sort of vendors and participants, many customers and developers at the event. People seem to be pretty excited. Sort of at the event in general. So I thought that is always a good sign. Rather than going to conferences where for one reason or another the sort of population tends to be pretty dead. Not the case here, which was great. Seen some commentary about the crowd size. I don't actually know what the numbers are. I didn't have them. Certainly the summit is not the largest event in the world. I'm a little biased in the sense that at Redmonk, we run our own events and we purposefully keep them small because we think that, frankly, you get a better event, sort of when you keep it smaller. So that wasn't a problem for me. Certainly I know there's some people who use it as a yardstick. My experience, having been going to these events for a very long time, is that the correlation between size and value, particularly from an attendee standpoint, is pretty weak, sort of at best. So, not an issue for me. Certainly it is for some. From a customer standpoint, customers were all over the place, sort of both in the hallways, in the hallway track, as well as sort of in the event itself. We had, conversations with, Comcast was all over this event. They're big sort of, they're big runners of Cloud Foundry internally. Philly also happens to be their home city. So that was, certainly a big part of it, American Airlines and on and on and on. In private, the analysts got to talk to, I can't remember how many vendors were, or customers rather, were on the panel, probably pretty close to a dozen. And we had the opportunity to follow up with some of them in private. And everybody seems to be pretty happy, generally speaking. All of them have, and this was a theme at the event, have sort of noted opportunities. I guess is sort of how it's most often referred to, i.e. things that they would like the project, the foundation, or both to work on. But by and large, the customer sentiment from our standpoint was excellent. It was a very good vibe. As far as sort of content at the event, it was really all over the place. I mean, I could spend hours sort of taking that apart. The couple things that stood out to me, there's really three of them. The cloud native build packs are something that we at Redmonk have tracked for a very long time, going back to their sort of inception at Heroku, sort of way back when. I believe it was 2011. Could be wrong on that. But anyhow, they've sort of popped up all over the place. And essentially, the sort of simplest way to describe them, in my views, is that it's essentially a way to take sort of code and translate it into sort of in the cloud native sense an OCI image, and sort of allow for the sort of quick reimaging of sort of at scale, without sort of massive disruption, and it's a quick way to encapsulate sort of a wide variety of software assets, sort of in a pack, for lack of a better term, and to quickly build that, and to do that at scale, sort of with minimal disruption. And the discussion sort of at the event itself obviously focused on the cloud native side of things. So, basically not just, hey, we have these build packs, but, how can we extend them and make them more valuable in sort of quote unquote cloud native contexts? So, the sort of the relevance and the resonance, of the concept, within those types of environments is perhaps unsurprising, right? In other words, if you are sort of, going down the cloud native path, one of the things that you want to be able to do is quickly and efficiently translate source code and some of the sort of attendant libraries and so on into into usable images, right? And to be able to both deploy and reimage those as necessary at scale, quickly, and efficiently. So the discussion of cloud native build packs I thought was sort of a vibrant area of discussion, shall we say. I thought it was interesting. Sort of one quick aside. That Amazon's Java image or Java essentially package Corretto got a shout out on the main stage. So that was that was notable, I guess. But sort of overall, discussion of cloud native build packs, is essentially what you expect, where you'd like to see things go. I think if you are certainly in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem, or frankly, if you're sort of in attended ecosystems, the build pack concept is one, again, that originated at Heroku, was picked up by the Cloud Foundry community, and it's now spread. It's in GitLab, it's in Knative, and Deis, and sort of all these other packages that we could talk about. That was certainly a big topic of discussion at the event and sort of amongst attendees. Digital transformation is not, some of you may be familiar, this is not a term that I'm overly fond of myself, because it's too broad. It's too it has to do too much work in many respects, in the sense that if you ask 10 people, you're probably going to get sort of 10 different 10 different definitions. My opinion on it personally has always been that basically it's, particularly in 2019, when we talk about digital transformation, ultimately what we're talking about is velocity, right? That is sort of far and away the most important characteristic from a from a digital transformation standpoint, because most of the businesses have been transformed digitally already. In other words, 5 or 10 years ago, it was rare, perhaps to have, I don't know, if you had a credit union, for example, they may not have online banking. That today is table stakes, right? If you don't have that, you're not in the game. So the question isn't, sort of, do many of these sort of businesses have essentially online sort of equivalents and online products? The question rather is, can they operate and iterate them at a pace, more importantly, sort of in a fashion essentially able to keep up with the digital natives, so to speak. So it was interesting, sort of in that note, sort of using that as my prior, when we talk about digital transformation, to really look at the sort of conversations that the Cloud Foundry Foundation, but more importantly, the Cloud Foundry customers, we're thinking about in terms of sort of their definition, their usage of digital transformation. So they had a couple sort of facts and figures which kind of stood out to me. Almost 80% by their survey, 77% thought digital transformation is a reality. Just shy of that, 3/4 exactly, 75% thought that digital transformation is not a sort of one-time transformative event, but rather it was essentially a perpetual state of being, right? And that is, sort of, again, very much aligned with my own sort of view on the matter, which is, hey, this isn't a big bang, sort of lift and shift. I'm going to take this, sort of antiquated business product or business model and sort of have some online equivalent. It's rather, I already have that, and how do I continue operating at the speed that I need to? So it was interesting to see sort of that validation. One of the most interesting sort of pieces from a I don't know, just a sort of state of the market, so to speak. So Cloud Foundry's been running the survey for a number of years, and this was the first time in the history of their survey, in terms of talking to people about sort of where they are from a digital transformation perspective, that the majority of the mission critical apps were running in the cloud. So it was just over the line. It was 51%, but that was a notable number, right? Because in many cases, the types and size of businesses that are sort of all in on Cloud Foundry are very, very sort of large Fortune 500 businesses. And, while, many of them have obviously sort of embraced Cloud Foundry, embraced, sort of many of the attendant cloud native traits, the majority of their businesses, the majority of their workloads, historically have still been sort of running on-prem, sort of running as they always have, historically. So that sort of, felt like, kind of, sort of an important mark. But overall, I thought that the conversations that we had, both, well, certainly in terms of the sort of public statements from the likes of American Airlines and, sort of users like that, sort of in their public talks, but perhaps just, sort of as importantly, if not more importantly, the conversations we had, which unfortunately had to be kept private, with some of the sort of participating customers there, really the sort of the stretch and depth of the transformation that you sort of hear behind the scenes is pretty remarkable. Basically from a retail side, for example, the sort of cultures here have been completely overthrown in a couple different ways. And that involves, both taking engineers and sending them into the field, as it was the case for a couple of retailers. And conversely, having, sort of essentially programs, boot camps, if you will, to take some of the cashiers that are interested and, sort of leveling them up into software engineering roles, right? So, we tend to talk when we speak about digital transformation, sort of in the technology industry as purely a sort of technical phenomenon. But, far more important and far more interesting for a lot of the customers is precisely how it's, basically, really changing the nature of these organizations themselves. Down to, hey, we talked to one retailer, and, they went through sort of really sort of extensive renovations of their existing facilities. And he was joking with us saying that, hey, they're ripping out so many cubicles and sort of, tearing apart offices that when he got back to the office after the summit this week, he was not terribly confident he was going to be able to find his desk. Digital transformation doesn't, I guess, just mean sort of the technology itself, but can certainly refer to, down to transforming the buildings, I guess, that we all work in. So that was digital transformation. And the last one here is sort of a blanket one. For the sort of last big takeaway, I guess, is sort of symbolized by Project Irene. So Irene is, let me sort of pull up my notes here and sort of refer you to the Cloud Foundry's description. Irene is an incubating effort within the Cloud Foundry Foundation, enabling pluggable scheduling for the Cloud Foundry application runtime. Operators can choose between Diego/Garden or Kubernetes to orchestrate application container instances. So basically what that means in a nutshell is that, you can essentially run you can run Kubernetes, or you can run Cloud Foundry rather with Kubernetes instead of, sort of in parallel or instead of effectively Kubernetes. And the takes on this were pretty interesting at the event itself. Basically sort of a lot of chatter, a lot of, sort of discussion, the excitement, sort of in some quarters that, hey, we can sort of take advantage of the momentum that Kubernetes has, while essentially gaining all the things that Cloud Foundry offers us on top of that. I've seen a couple external pieces that have been pretty critical of the move. One actually went so far as to call, to basically sort of claim that this signaled the demise of Cloud Foundry. I thought it was interesting that the piece itself quoted, had scare quotes around demise in the title and had to essentially explain in the first paragraph that it didn't really mean demise. So I'm not really sure what was going on there. From my perspective, look, this is essentially a pretty straightforward equation, right? In the sense that, I was asked in sort of a analyst panel on, what was that, Wednesday morning, sort of what was a characteristic of sort of strong development teams. And one of the things I cited then is the same thing I would cite from a project and organization standpoint, right, which is versatility and flexibility. And, I quoted, sort of in that panel, Montesquieu, and I'll use the same quote here because I think it's relevant, which says that the main reason for the Romans becoming masters of the world was that having fought successively against all peoples, they always gave up their own practices as soon as they found better ones. And I'm quite sure that the folks in the Cloud Foundry project and the Cloud Foundry Foundation and many in the ecosystem would, sort of take issue with the sort of implicit claim there that Kubernetes is better technology than Diego/Garden. But sort of the reality is, sort of whatever we say about the sort of quality and the engineering that the sort of states, from a technical comparison state, the reality is that Kubernetes is a hugely adopted piece of technology. One that has sort of grown exponentially. So we at Redmonk are fond of saying all the time that not only doesn't the best product win every time, it doesn't win most of the time. And what that means by default is that in many cases, what you have to do from a project governance standpoint is be flexible and versatile enough to incorporate other pieces of technology along the way, if they prove to be more popular, if they give you some sort of inherent advantage. So that to me is basically the gist of Irene, which is, hey, look, if you want to keep using the sort of the native Cloud Foundry ecosystem parts in Diego and Garden, knock yourself out. But for the organizations that have sort of gone all in on Kubernetes, this offers them essentially the opportunity to get some of the same benefits, sort of that Cloud Foundry users, but enjoy and sort of appreciate their investments in the Kubernetes ecosystem as well. And I had this conversation with somebody at the event, and they came back and said, well, hey, Kubernetes is sort of just enough by itself, which is not my experience in terms of talking to Kubernetes people. Most of them will tell you that Kubernetes is a sort of great base to build from, but you need to build things on top of it. And frankly, that's been sort of the market expectation as well. If you look at one of the more successful distributions of Kubernetes in Red Hat's OpenShift, certainly it's Kubernetes as a foundation, but Red Hat has had quite a bit in sort of around that to enhance sort of the value and the sort of scope of the project. So to me, that's really what Cloud Foundry is doing here. Frankly, this is something that I have been sort of agitating for publicly and privately for several years now. So again, it's probably part of my prior, that this is something that I've expected, but they also talked about this in sort of other quarters besides Kubernetes. There's a lot of discussion sort of with the embrace of Envoy, the embrace of Istio, and other projects sort of in the sort of CNCF orbit. So, the industry has a tendency and a desire in many cases to want to make this into a sort of Kubernetes sort of versus Cloud Foundry deathmatch, and that's fine, and certainly to a large degree they compete. But from speaking practically, I think speaking sort of on behalf of the number of the users I talked to at the event here, I don't see any reason that they can't frankly leverage both and leverage particularly if Irene is successful and sort of comes through incubation to use that sort of as a to use that basically directly, essentially to plug Kubernetes directly into Cloud Foundry, and to get the benefits theoretically both. So that is sort of those are the big takeaways I think from a content perspective. From my perspective, for it's perspective twice. Really those are the sort of I don't there's any number of different things that we could talk about. I think if there's sort of one comment that I would leave this session on and this video on was essentially the stark contrast really in terms of a small number of years. So we're not allowed to disclose unfortunately who it was who said this because the customer panel that I'm quoting from was strictly NDA, but I thought the quote used anonymously I thought was very telling. And one of the sort of executives, asked, basically said, in response to a question about sort of how Cloud Foundry and some of these technologies has changed his approach. He said, 5 years ago, I as a technology leader used to spend half my time on the workflow of provisioning servers and databases. Today, I spend 0% of my time on that. And to be fair, this is a this is a conservative enterprises, and I'm sure many startups are saying 5 years, hell, I've been doing this for, much longer than that. But, the simple fact of the matter is that, a lot of the businesses that are Cloud Foundry customers, a lot of the businesses that, make up the Fortune 250, Fortune 500, they don't move particularly quickly. And, they don't do that for good reason. They want, in many cases, for these technologies to prove themselves, such that if they make a bet that, that bet is going to be around for quite some time. And, I think the net takeaway from, most of the people that we spoke with, most of the customers we spoke with at the event, is that they're pretty comfortable, with a bet that they made on Cloud Foundry and the ecosystem around it. And more particularly, again, going back to the Irene choice, they're actually more comfortable now than they were, prior to that announcement, because, they're going to be able to leverage, sort of the Kubernetes strength within their organization within the context of their Cloud Foundry investments. So with that, that's my sort of take and my wrap up on the Cloud Foundry Summit 2019. And I hope you found it of interest. If there's any questions, I'm not terribly difficult to find on social media. S.O.Grady, S-O-G-R-A-D-Y. And yeah, just stop by redmonk.com as always, to find your developer-related research. Thanks so much.